Hello, and welcome to the pre-session learning for youth empowerment and restorative justice. My name is Griffen Castillo. I'm from Oakland, California, otherwise known as Chochenyo Ohlone land, and my pronouns are he, him, and they, them. Part of the pre-session learning that I want to share with you all right now is the ladder of student involvement, right? And we'll touch on the name a little bit later, but for now, let's just talk about this ladder. There's 8 rungs, right? And each one is valid and important at different times, right? And it's not a way to judge or discredit people's work, because you can't say that a classroom or a school is on one rung, right? This applies to different students at different times, right? It's not meant to represent the entire school at once. Instead, it represents each specific instance of student involvement, right? We have to apply this in these understandings to every time we engage with youth. And the rungs in order are manipulation, decoration, tokenization, student informed, students consulted, students are equal, it's student driven, and then student equity, right? And let's talk about what those look like and what those things really are. We'll start with the first one, where of student manipulation, right? And this is where adults manipulate students, where students are forced to attend without regard to their interest or whether or not they want to be involved in that, right? And it's also important to note that none of these are all bad, right? And none of these are bad, as we call them. There's pros and cons to all of these, right? Sometimes it's necessary to manipulate students, right? Because when you do, it allows them to have that experience of being involved, regardless of what it is, right? But that doesn't discredit the hard part as well, and that challenge. That second piece, where adults use students to decorate their activities. Second, and this looks like the presence of students is all that's necessary, right? You don't have to actually make an effort to involve or actively involve or engage or empower youth, but the fact that they're there is enough. And that's what decoration is, right? The third part, where adults are tokenizing students. That's where students are involved in an insignificant and oftentimes meaningless role, so that adults in the classroom and the school can say that they're engaging with students, right? And those three are non-engagement. This is not engaging with youth or empowering, right? Then let's go to the fourth one, where students inform adults. And this is important, right? Because it means that now adults are listening to students and student voices being heard. But the struggle with this is that adults do not necessarily have to let students impact their decisions, right? Adults are still in a power role and they get to decide whether or not they want to involve youth. Then the fifth one, right? Student consulted. Um, and in this one, students have the authority that adults grant them, right? They don't get to make decisions and delegate their own roles. They get to be where adults say they get to be, right? And they have to be approved by adults, right? Students are consulted, but not a part of it, right? And this is partial engagement, right? It's not quite there. We're not quite really working with youth, but we're definitely getting there, right? And let's move on to engagement and what that really looks like. And let's start with the sixth one, right? Where students are fully equal with adults while they're involved. There's a 50-50 split in power and obligation, right? And this is good. This is important. This means that youth are seen as equals and they have the capacity and responsibility and agency to make decisions within whatever role it is and work with adults. That's the important piece, right? Working with. But it's hard because we all have pros and cons, right? Like we all have our own struggles and our own strengths. So 50-50 might not always be the right case. We'll get to that later. And then the next piece, number 7, got my numbers right this time, is student driven, right? This is where adults really take a back seat in these roles and let students really drive the work. This is a hard step because it's that power sharing that we've talked about, right? And power sharing is one of the critical things in schools that prevents youth from being really engaged and really empowered, right? And part of that is stepping back, right? Because if you know that you have more power in spaces, stepping back means that you're sharing it, right? But this isn't quite it. You know, when we talk about equity in a partnership, it looks like this, right? And this is the eighth rung of the ladder. Where students have equity with adults, It doesn't mean that everybody's equal and they all have the same responsibilities, because that would be unfair, right? Students have school and other things, and adults have other things, and teachers might have a lot of other work too, right? And equity is being flexible and adjusting and supporting wherever it is, right? This can look like a 40-60 split in power. This can look like a 20-80 split in power and delegation, or the other way, a 20-80, right? Might have said that twice, but I think you get the point. And it's dependent, right? And this is what we're really looking for, right? That collaboration and that conversation, in saying that I respect you and understand you, and I'm willing to give up my power if it means that we collectively can move further, right? And I also want to note, like I shared in the beginning, that none of these steps are bad or necessarily good, right? Sometimes manipulation is necessary. Sometimes it's not possible or realistic to engage in an equitable way, right? But let's talk about that a little. Let's talk about how each of these can be necessary, right? Back to the first run, where adults are manipulating students. Though this might not be healthy in the long run, it can involve students in things, right? If a teacher tells a student that you have to come to this or be a part of this, then it means the students are there, right? And that's why it's still on the ladder, right? It's not where we want to be all the time, and we're always looking to be equitable, but it means that we can start bringing youth in different ways, right? And when you start decorating and tokenizing with students, yes, they're not necessarily engaged all the way, or they're not being empowered as we want them to, but they're still having more of a role, right? They're more valuable than just manipulating, right? And they're in the picture still. And then for the fourth and the fifth one, right? Like we talked about, it's students are still subjugated to adults, right? And adults still have that capacity to tell students what to do and decide whether or not student input is worth it or valuable. Now, that's not where we want to be again, right? But it means that students are involved, right? Adults are listening to students. They still get to choose and they still have power, but students are starting to get more and more capacity and agency to really be involved in these things, right? And when we talk about empowering, it's building that capacity, right? And when we show students that they are able to, and that they should, and that they can have a voice in these spaces, they start stepping up more, right? And then the sixth, seventh, and eighth, that real engagement, right? That's when we really start empowering students and youth in these spaces. When we remind them that they're equal, and their voice and their power and their all of their skills and tools are valuable and worth it, right? That's empowerment. When we know that students can drive the work, right? That rung seven, where it's student and youth driven, that's empowering, right? When an adult or an authority figure says, you can do this, I trust in you, I'm here to support, what do you need from me? This is your work, right? It encourages students to really take ownership for the work, and be accountable for it and be proud of it too. And make mistakes, which is part of learning, right? That's that tough piece. And then the eighth one, right? That equity piece, right? That's where we want to be going. We want to be in a partnership with adults and students together, so that we can collaborate and talk about what our needs are and how we can support each other in reaching them, right? But it's not an easy thing to get there, right? It takes going up these steps to really be ready for that equity piece, right? You have to have students at the table. You have to be students involved, right? Sometimes it looks like manipulating students and tokenizing them so that you can bring them to the spaces. You have to be able to consult and inform students and have conversations, right? And begin that process, right? Some of us are starting on one, some of us are starting on seven, and it's not better or worse. We're figuring out how we can move up and continue to move up, and even when you get to that top rung, it's not like you stay there, right? It's a continuous effort to be in equity with students. Um, but yeah, that's a brief overview on what the ladder is. And I want to remind you all that it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. We're all in a different context and we have a different place in this, right? And it's important to think about how we can move up and down as well. And I hope you had a good time in this space. If throughout any of this you had any questions, please feel free to bring them to this space so that I can answer them and support in any way that I can, right? Um, and whether or not you actually come to the workshop, right? This is a valuable tool. So I encourage you to reflect on your own context and your own activities and how you engage with students, right? Because this isn't a broad thing that you can say that, oh, a school is at rung 8 or a school is equitable engaging with students. It's each individual action. So how are we engaging with students day to day, minute to minute, so that we're empowering them? Thank you. I'll see you all soon. I have to figure out how to stop this.